Hi, I'm Marisol Dothard, and I'm here with Eyal Press. And we just finished up a great talk about his book, Beautiful Souls, and I'm here to ask him some questions. What was the starting point for you to sort of spearhead a project of this magnitude? There was so much research you mentioned earlier.
I think, as I said in the talk, I felt like I honestly felt there wasn't a good book out there about people who, when in these compromising situations, find their courage for whatever reason. I felt like some of the literature out there is this kind of unencoded profiles of courage without much analysis, without grappling with some of the more complicated philosophical and political questions. And then another body of literature, very different, in more academic literature, is extremely abstract and doesn't include stories of actual people who carry out acts of courage. So I wanted to fill what I thought was missing. That was the idea of the book.
It's so great you did that so well. You mentioned a little bit earlier, how long did you say it took you to compile all of that data? There was a lot of interviews, for sure.
Well, the book began in 2000, I guess late 2007, and it was published in 2012, so that's like 4.5 years. I wasn't always working full-time on it, because that's the nature of people who write books. Aren't sitting on a trust fund, that one has to do a lot of other things during the time of doing the work, but it unfolded over a 4-year period.
That's great. You present a lot of ideas showing both what courage is and what courage can do to your life. So what do you want people to take away from your book?
I think more than anything, I want them to think about what courage actually means. Does it just mean storming a hillside in a war, which is the sort of conventional notion of physical courage, the courage to serve your country, or does it mean something else, which has a moral component and an oppositional component, to have the courage to refuse, to have the courage to question, to have the courage to dissent, and in each of the cases in the book, these are people who are transgressing what is expected of them by their superiors, and in some cases by their governments, and I hope that people engage with that, because we need more of that, I think, in our society.
Absolutely. What were your original thoughts on courage before you started the book?
Well, sometimes when I'm asked about sort of personal narrative that mirrors the book, I talk about the third character, the Israeli soldier, who grows up wanting to serve in the military and does serve in the military, and then becomes a refusenik, someone who, on principle, doesn't serve in the occupied territories. And in a way, that story mirrors my own evolution, I would say, when it comes to thinking about courage. I grew up very much thinking of courage as kind of, are you tough? Are you man enough to, pick up a gun and risk your life and jump out of an airplane and do all the things that boys who have, played war games think about. And then I would say when I was 18, I started to question whether that's the only form of courage there is, and by the time I finished college, I kind of arrived at a pretty sharply opposed view, which is that it takes a lot more courage in many cases to resist the impulse to pick up a gun, and to resist the impulse to attack and prove your manhood. That there's an enormous courage that comes from being able to not harm others in those ways.
Absolutely. Were there any philosophers when you started your book that you really called to as opposed to maybe after reading the book? Because you mentioned that you had some help in finding philosophers who would help you.
Well, I was very lucky to have, I think, a brilliant philosopher and sociologist at NYU, Stephen Luke's, read the manuscript, and he helped a lot. He pointed out some things that, in retrospect, were completely correct, but that I was ignorant of. He encouraged me to read David Hume and Adam Smith, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, both of which figure in the book. And to maybe look beyond just discussing neuroscience and the latest kind of discussion of morality that these days is so bound up in science and neuroscience in particular. So that was really helpful.
And we can see from the first book, Absolute Convictions, that you have had first-hand experiences dealing with the consequences of having to face what you believe in through your father. And was this maybe a factor in kind of kickstarting your project also?
That's very astute. I would say that as that book shows, I grew up in a household where there was a family member, my father, the person I was growing up modeling myself after, who I think displayed a great deal of courage in his own profession as an abortion provider, who continued to serve as an abortion provider in a period of extreme turmoil, opposition, and threat, very direct threats. And at the same time, and I think that was courage, both of a sort of physical kind and also principle. At the same time, in this book, I grapple a little bit, as I just said, with some forms of courage that maybe I was raised to think of that I later came to question. So I guess you could say that it's been a kind of motif in my life for much of my life.
Wow, and some of the characters, as you admit in the book, did not lead particularly impressive or even moral lifestyles. Do you feel the courage is a lifestyle, or is it choice by choice? Is it possible to live courageously?
I think that very few of us live courageously all the time. I think that it's just not human, and it would be unreasonable to expect. And so we pick our moments, and hopefully when the stakes are very high and we come to a situation where not being courageous would really cost us something very dear, or cost someone else something very dear. Hopefully, at those moments, you can find your courage. Now, the reality is that often we fail. Maybe that's one of the reasons that we're fascinated by studying courage and by studying and learning about and thinking about people who do find their courage in those moments, because we want to be able to rise to that occasion, and maybe we fear rightly that we won't.
Right, and speaking of those studies, you talk a lot about the tests run with individuals in your book. When the individuals were asked to harm others, as long as they were willing to pass on blame to the person in authority, they were very willing to push the boundaries of what was appropriate for inflicting harm on others. What do you believe this says about the concept of moral responsibility?
I think that what it shows, what both the social psychology experiments I talk about in the book and human history and our present day history actually is that we live in a world where it's very easy to defer and deflect responsibility to others, and so there are reasonable cases to be made for why, well, it's not my fault, it's not my responsibility, I'm not the one doing this, and I didn't make this terrible policy, I'm just trying to survive in this situation. Those are very reasonable things for people to feel. At the same time, if that's what we all say, it becomes very easy for all of us to deflect responsibility and no one to take it. And I think that in so many cases, and in recent American experience, if you look at the torture issue, who really took responsibility for that? Nobody. Congress produced a very important report saying, this is something that happened, and questioning why it happened. But was Congress really in the dark about it? Was the Senate really in the dark? So in a way, it just feels, it's a very dark illustration of how easily, on a very grave moral matter, responsibility gets just sort of passed to everybody else and then to no one.
Absolutely. And when that responsibility gets passed to, say, the self, we talk about whistleblowers. And whistleblowers in this culture kind of tend to get mixed reviews, even though they're trying to call attention to behavior that they believe is wrong. Do you think it is ever justifiable to make it known that you find something that just doesn't sit right with you, or do you think it's better to keep it to yourself after seeing stories like Layla's?
I mean, I would guess that most people who read my book will see it as a very pro-whistleblower book, which it is. I generally feel whistleblowers are people who often pay a very dear personal price for something that ends up benefiting society. In other words, they lose their jobs, their reputations are stained, and the rest of us gain because they were willing to take the hit for that. Now, that doesn't mean that every act of whistleblowing is admirable. Sometimes people blow the whistle in an irresponsible way, or over an issue that turns out to be exaggerated or a reflection of a misperception. So obviously the acts have to be judged, but I generally think that the more that people feel they can speak out about wrongdoing and injustice when it happens in the workplace or in a large bureaucratic institution, the better off we all are.
And if there was one more story that you could add, and I'm sure you must have sifted through a lot of them to do when you're doing your research, who would you add? Brief synopsis.
Wow. If I could have known in advance, and I could have gotten an exclusive interview, and I could have put it in the book, clearly I would have a chapter on Edward Snowden. Not for the least reason that the book would be wildly popular, more popular. It just his story hadn't broken. The book came out, then it happened, and I thought, this sounds eerily familiar. Why wasn't I onto this? But of course, timing didn't work out. So.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Mr. Press.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.